Hello, class. Welcome to Chapter 5, Problems and Solutions in Modern Policing. So first of all, we have to talk about this word discretion. It's a huge word in law enforcement, and it's an important word. So despite the possibility of mistakes, courts generally have upheld the patrol officer's freedom to decide what laws to enforce, how much to enforce it, against whom, and on what occasions. This judicial support of police discretion is based on a number of factors. We have to remember that police officers are considered trustworthy and are therefore assumed to make honest decisions regardless of contradictory testimony by a suspect. We also have to talk about the fact that experience and training gives officers the ability to determine whether a certain activity poses a threat to society and to take any reasonable action necessary to investigate or prevent such activity. Also, due to the nature of the job, police officers are very knowledgeable about human behavior and, by extension, criminal behavior. Police officers also may find themselves in danger of personal physical harm, and they must be allowed to take reasonable and necessary steps to protect themselves. So there are some factors of police discretion. There is no doubt that subjective factors influence police discretion. The officer's beliefs, their values, personality, their background, all of that enter into his or her decisions. And to a large extent, however, a law enforcement agent's actions are determined by the rules of policing that is set into the Constitution. That's it. It's enforced by the courts through the Constitution. So some of these elements of discretion, assuming that most police officers stay on the right side of the Constitution, in most instances, there are 4 other factors that generally enter the discretion equation in any particular situation. So first of all, what is the nature of the criminal act? That's important. A second element is often considered is the attitude of the wrongdoer toward the officer. So what is their attitude when you pull them over for a traffic stop? How do they interact with you? Third, the relationship between the victim and the offender can influence the outcome. And the fourth factor is, of course, departmental policy. What is the department's policy? So this is So this is a graphic that shows how departmental chain of command is. Remembering that chain of command is paramilitary, and there definitely is a chain of command that needs to be followed in any sort of law enforcement situation. So we want to make sure that hold on, guys. Let me make sure. Oh, yeah. I want to talk about a few other things on this in my lecture notes that are important. Use of force. So when we're talking about policies, we know that there are use of force policies. Some departments forbid chokeholds. Actually, most departments forbid use of chokeholds or strangleholds or firing at a moving vehicle unless someone in the vehicle poses a deadly threat. There were times that departments allowed you to shoot warning shots out your window. I would be surprised if there's any left that do that. So we have to remember that policies are written, and another common requirement is that officers give verbal warning before there's any sort of use of deadly force. So how do officers fight crime? Well, we know that it's a bureaucracy. So there are formal rules that govern an individual's actions and their relationships with their co-employees. But the ultimate goal of any bureaucracy is to reach its efficiency. So the best service that a police department can give within the for the community within the confines of its resources. So let's look at the structure of the police department, which is where we were. So we are talking about the chain of command, and you guys can see that one of the biggest things is that there is definitely a structure. Now, some departments may be a little more open door, but you certainly wouldn't want to go see your deputy chief if you hadn't first talked to your lieutenant or your sergeant about something. One of the goals, though, of a lot of police reformers, especially beginning in the 1950s, was to lessen the corrupting influence of politicians. And the result was this move towards this militaristic organization of police. So you can see this chain of command. There is definitely a delegation of authority, and it's a critical component of the chain of command, especially in larger departments. So the ideal number of subordinates for a police sergeant, for example, is 8 to 10 patrol officers. And this number is often referred to as the span of control. If the span of control rises above 15, it's assumed that the superior officer will not be able to effectively manage his or her team. So we're going to go over some of the law enforcement, the field operations of law enforcement. And so to a large extent, the main goal of any police department is to be the most efficient organization of its field services. So also known as operations or line services, field services include patrol, investigations, and special operations. So larger departments may be more specialized, with personnel assigned to specific types of crime, illegal drugs, white-collar crime, or even geographic locations. And smaller departments, which make up the bulk of local law enforcement agencies, rely almost exclusively on general patrol. So we're going to start off and talk about police on patrol. So more than 2/3 of sworn officers, which are officers that are authorized to make arrests or use force in local police departments in the United States, have some sort of patrol duties. Patrol officers must be able to handle any number of difficult situations, and experience is often the best. So one thing to remember is, a lot of students come in and talk about I want to be a detective. Well, everybody has to be a patrol officer before they can be a detective. That's how you really learn about law enforcement, is your time on patrol. So there are 3 primary purposes of police patrol. As an accountability expert, Samuel Walker noted, the basic purposes of the police patrol have changed very little since 1829, when Sir Robert Peel, we know, founded the modern police department. And these purposes are as follows, and they're on your slides here. But the deterrence of crime by maintaining a visible police presence, the maintenance of public order and a sense of security in the community, and the 24-hour provision of certain services that are not crime-related. So there are also community concerns with patrol, of course, and the extent to which non-crime incidents dominate patrol officers' time is evident in a study that was done, which was a survey of 26,000 calls to police in 60 different neighborhoods. And what this study found was that only 1 out of every 5 calls involved the report of criminal activity. So furthermore, the police are on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that really makes them uniquely accessible to citizens. So mental illness is a huge piece of what law enforcement often will find themselves dealing with. According to various studies, between 7% and 10% of all police public contacts involve people with mental illness. And to better prepare officers for dealing with these situations, there are law enforcement agencies that have this mandatory crisis intervention team, CIT team. And these have training programs. And what these training programs do is they help law enforcement officers to know a little bit more about how to deal with those suffering from mental health problems or mental health crises. They also will put this team on call so that they can come out and respond to requests. And then there are drop-off locations for these individuals after the SIT team sees them, maybe at a hospital or a mobile crisis vehicle. So some other patrol activities that I want you guys to know about. And so departments have obviously different methods and strategies, but routine patrol activity can be divided into 4 general categories. So preventative patrol, that's going to be maintaining a presence in the community. So maybe you're in your car driving around a certain community, or maybe you're walking through a downtown neighborhood or a business area. And what police officers are doing is they're using their presence, which is their first line of force, which is just officer presence, to attempt to prevent crime from occurring. Calls for service. Of course, patrol officers spend nearly a quarter of their time responding to 911 calls for emergency service or other citizen problems and complaints. And you guys, this can vary from people call the police for everything, call 911 for everything. I spent time responding to calls by parents who couldn't get their kids out of bed for school. That is not the right way to use law enforcement services. So there's also administrative duties, which are things like paperwork, and that takes nearly 20% of patrol time. And I will tell you that there is more paper in law enforcement that you don't ever think about when you're thinking about being a law enforcement officer. Lots of paperwork. And then, of course, officer-initiated activities. Those are incidents in which the patrol officer initiates contact with citizens, traffic stops, knock and talks, or getting out with people and doing FIs, which is field interviews. So, just talking to people is a big piece of it. And then, of course, my love, police investigations. So investigation is the second main function of police along with patrol. Patrol is primarily preventative, and then investigation is the reactive side of it. So after a crime's been committed, the patrol officers gathered all that preliminary information from the crime scene. The responsibility of finding the whodunit is delegated to the investigator. That's going to be generally known as the detective. And the most common way for someone to become a detective is to be promoted from a patrol officer. So there are lots of different strategies that detectives use in their work. Detective bureaus have lots of different options for implementing aggressive strategies. For example, if detectives suspect that a person was involved in a robbery of a Mercedes-Benz parts warehouse, one of them might pose as a fence or a purchaser for stolen goods. In what's known as a sting, the suspect is deceived into thinking that the detective wants to buy the stolen car parts. Perhaps the most dangerous and controversial operation a law enforcement agent can undertake is to go undercover. And undercover operations officers assume a false identity in order to obtain information concerning illegal activities. So in some situations, a detective bureau might not want to take that risk of exposing an officer to undercover work, or may believe that an outsider cannot infiltrate an organized crime network. There's also lower levels of working undercover. I would do undercover prostitution work, and that was always super exciting. Could tell you lots about that. So there are, different levels of undercover work. So when the police need access to information, they have an option of turning to a CI, confidential informant. And this is a human source that is involved in criminal activity and gives information about that activity to the police. CIs can often be paid small amounts for their information, but they can also work off legal issues that they may have pending by becoming a CI. Oops. So, preventative policing, before we roll on to clearance rates, these investigative strategies really play a crucial role also in what the federal government's doing to combat domestic terrorism. Terrorists need help to procure the weaponry that they needed. So they are it's good that there are CIs and people that are giving some information out to law enforcement. The recent conviction of Emmanuel Lutschman provides an example of preventative policing, a popular counterterrorism strategy employed by the federal government. I do not know about that case, but I believe that there might be something in your textbook about that. But if there is not, feel free to read that if you're interested in domestic terrorism and the prevention of that. So let's talk about clearance rates in cold cases. So, really, the ultimate goal of all law enforcement activity is to clear a crime, right? Secure the arrest, prosecute the offender. Even a cursory glance at clearance rates, which show the percentage of reported crimes that have been cleared, reveals that investigations succeed only part of the time. And as a result of low clearance rates, police departments have been saddled with an increasing number of cold cases or criminal investigations that are not cleared after a certain amount of time. So we're going to pause here and we'll go on and talk about forensic experts and DNA in our next video.